Chapter 20 takes a look at the progressive era, which is a really long period of time that is tough to put into a box chronologically, but it does sort of encompass this major movement of reform, and that reform era could be in social, economic, political, racial areas. But really, there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. And the first being the four constitutional amendments that are ratified and added to the United States Constitution during this time period, sort of the culmination of the efforts of the progressive reformers that took place over the course of several decades, right? So in one case, you have the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment is the federal income tax. This is something that the populace had asked for, and that other middle class and lower class people had asked for, sort of the rich need to pay their fair share. And the graduated federal income tax, the 16th Amendment, placed at the federal level those tax brackets that we're so used to, meaning the more you make, the more percentage you'll pay each year in federal taxes to the government. The 17th Amendment was also a populist sort of progressive era reform movement, and the 17th Amendment allocated for the direct election of United States senators by popular vote. Without going into a big constitutional thing about this with the founders, this placed the one check upon quote unquote democracy that was found in the legislature. The fact that the senators, the two senators that each state gets in the United States Senate, had previously been chosen by state leaders and state legislatures in the capitals. This was a check on democracy because the founders felt that the people, us, could sometimes not be trusted to pick the best people to represent us in D.C. And so they permitted us to elect directly our members in the House of Representatives, but because we couldn't be trusted that those two senators would be chosen by state leaders who, of course, make the better educated decisions about who could represent us there. Again, this was a call during the progressive era that the government needed to be more answerable to its people. And this goes back to the two-party system that I talked about in previous chapters. The two-party system does not always speak for every minority group, right? And we talked about the populace as an example of that. All right. The 18th and the 19th Amendments, the 18th being the Prohibition Amendment, being the banning of the production, the sale, the manufacturing, the consuming of alcohol. It was seen as such a social vice that was killing the moral fiber of the country, that alcohol was made illegal. This was pretty much the culmination of almost a century of efforts by temperance reformers. Probably the most successful one, the most impactful one, became the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, led by women like Alice Paul, Carrie Nation. And this was the banning of alcohol. Of course, this amendment would be repealed about a decade later with the 21st Amendment in the early 1930s. So it was, didn't work, right? And then finally, the 19th Amendment, which is by far the most important one, which granted the right to vote to all women throughout the United States. Now, a lot of states had already granted women the right to vote, Wyoming being the first one back in the 19th century. But the 19th Amendment made it so that all women everywhere throughout the United States could vote, okay? Now, the one thing that this didn't do, though, and this will come down later in the civil rights movement, is that, yes, it said you could not tell women they couldn't vote because they're women, but it didn't outlaw things like the poll tax, which were still very powerful in states to disenfranchise and deny the right to vote to poor people, and specifically the aim being to deny the right to vote to people of color. So a lot of Black women were still denied the right to vote because of that poll tax, right? So how did people become aware of all of these problems, right, that had to be addressed by the progressive era? Well, primarily it was because of a group of journalists that were called muckrakers. This is what Roosevelt called them. Teddy Roosevelt called them. Remember, don't confuse Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, two very different politicians with very different ideologies, okay? Teddy Roosevelt came first, and they were only distant cousins. So Teddy Roosevelt called them muckrakers. You can look up why he did that. But essentially what he said was, these are the journalists, sort of like today we would see like an undercover journalist, an investigative journalist that exposes the ills of what's going on, right? So some of the more famous or infamous muckrakers of their time were men like Jacob Riis, who exposed the living conditions of the working class in New York in his book, How the Other Half Lives. people like Lincoln Steffens, who exposed the corruption in Standard Oil, women like Ida Wells, who divulged and discovered data that could prove that lynchings were racially motivated and they were not the result of some sort of uprising of the population in these cities to you know bring justice on their own part, than the fact that they were actually really just racially motivated as murder, right? And then also probably the most famous one of this time was Upton Sinclair, who published his book The Jungle, which exposed the unsanitary and unsafe conditions in the meatpacking industry. Okay. So a lot of these people were instrumental in first exposing the problems that then the government was forced to deal with, right? And they dealt with some of those through the amendments, but other times it was through legislation, right? And so we sort of consider the progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And to varying extents, their administrations accomplished varying successes, right? So we know that Teddy Roosevelt is probably best known for his progressive reform of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which cleaned up the sanitation and safety conditions in the food industry and drug industry. William Howard Taft is known for going after more monopolies and trusts than any president during this time. And Woodrow Wilson being sort of the more progressive of the two, according to many historians. Take that for what it's worth. Overseeing the creation of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, et cetera, et cetera. So what you have here is a very long period of time in which there's a lot of progress, right? Improvements, okay? One area, though, that is lacking in progress during this time is civil rights. During this time, you have the foundation of the NAACP, you have the Niagara Movement, the Talented Tenth, but you see a lot of regression in civil rights. And this is consistent throughout all three of these presidents' administrations, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. None of them were friends of people of color, and in many ways, they were outright, blatant, unabashed racists. Teddy Roosevelt certainly was someone who believed that white men were superior and that they should not be criticized or apologize for conquesting non-white people or for inserting their influence over non-whites. Taft certainly continued that theory through dollar diplomacy in Latin and Central America. And Woodrow Wilson, by far the most egregious racist president since Andrew Johnson in the years right after the Civil War, was unabashedly pro-white race, pro-Anglo-Saxon, and we will see this in a lot of his decisions that he makes during World War I, in his role in negotiating and setting the terms of the peace of the Treaty of Versailles and the redrawing of the borders of Europe. Wilson is infamously known for hosting the first screening of a motion picture within the White House. And this tragically was the film The Birth of a Nation, which is a pro-Ku Klux Klan film. And so that is another bad stain on American history. But Wilson sometimes is forgotten for the fact that when he became president, he resegregated the federal government. The federal government office buildings had been integrated. He came in and said, integration causes friction between the races, and so we are going to resegregate the federal government, which was a huge step backwards in the civil rights movement, something that got him tremendous criticism from civil rights leader like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard, who was unabashedly openly critical of these administrations and their lack of being willing to help African Americans achieve a sense of semblance of citizenship and equality within the United States.